live at the Labour Party conference in Brighton. Joining me, the leader of Scottish Labour, Anas Sarwar, and Politico's UK political editor, Jack Blanchard. We're here at Keir Starmer's first in-person party conference. This morning, we've heard from the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves.
This government is incompetent. This government is in denial. This government are careless and they are chaotic, and they are responsible for this mess.
We'll talk about that with Shadow Cabinet Minister Emily Thornberry. There have been arguments over party rules, but what do voters think?
I'd be more inclined to vote for Keir Starmer than I would for Jeremy Corbyn.
Keir, oh bless him. Yeah. He's so educated and such a clever man, but so unpopular.
And while Labour gathers here, what are ministers saying after a weekend of panic buying at the pumps?
The only reason we don't have petrol on forecourts is that people are buying petrol when they don't need it.
So, the sun is out finally after a rather stormy start today to the conference, and Keir Starmer is also out and about, the first time for the party faithful really to eyeball him because, of course, he was elected leader during the pandemic. And he's had a tricky balancing act of both supporting and criticising the government. But Labour is behind in the polls, and there are many even on his own side within the party who say they still don't know what Keir Starmer stands for. Jack, how high are the stakes for him?
It's a really big moment for Keir Starmer. You know, he's had this weird sort of phony war period as leader of the Labour Party for the past 18 months during the pandemic. Being here in Brighton this week suddenly feels like politics is getting back to normal, people rubbing shoulders again and drinking together in the bars and so on. So this is the first chance Keir Starmer's got to actually come face to face with his party and tell them who he really is. The problem that he's got is that we have a country that looks like it's in crisis out there. Everyone's seen the queues down the street for the petrol. And all the rest of it, and yet what they see here is a party very much talking to itself and arguing with itself, as Labour tends to do. And so the image, while Keir Starmer thinks that what he's doing here is very important and all the rest of it, and yet what they see here is a party very much talking to itself and arguing with itself, as Labour tends to do. And so
to define your leadership in the middle of a pandemic, when you have, in your case, a Scottish government that's been at the helm during a health crisis?
Yeah, look, undoubtedly, there's a challenge around... Look, politics is first and foremost about communities and actually being amongst people, not actually what happens in Parliament chambers. And I think having the opportunity to hear directly from Keir, not just speaking directly to the party faithful, actually talking directly to the public about who he is, what drives him and what kind of change he would bring as Prime Minister, I think is really important.
Are you sure? Do you know?
Look, absolutely, I know. I know
what drives him. And
absolutely, this is someone that is driven by social justice, driven by the fight for equality, and someone that desperately wants to change this country, and is a perfect contrast to the dithering and the clown-like actions of Boris Johnson.
And now, do you feel that the sort of mask of COVID, if you like, as that stage is disappearing, you won't be able to hide behind that, Keir Starmer?
Look, the opposite. I actually think it is liberating. As a political leader that's been elected during a pandemic, actually had an election during a pandemic, I at least had the chance of getting out there and speaking to parts of the public through an election campaign. Keir Starmer's not had that opportunity yet, and I think the more people get to know him, the more he gets to make a case about how Britain can change. I think more people will want him, and more we have a chance to beat the Tories. Well,
now, one way, of course, of doing that is to grab some headlines in the way the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, did. There she is on the front page of The Times. The headline says, "Scum, insult and tax rises split Labour leadership." Now, that's after Angela Rayner referred to members of the government as homophobic, racist, misogynistic and vile, and a bunch of scum. Do you agree with her?
Look, we've all got strong views about the Conservative Party and the Conservative government. It's not language I would use.
But you agree with the
and
sentiment?
I think, look, do we have a government that is about
that's
us versus
homophobic,
them?
racist, misogynistic and vile?
Do we have a government that is dividing people? Absolutely we do. Do we have a government that's overseeing an increase of prejudice and hate across our country? Absolutely we do. But it's really important that we talk to people and actually persuade people to come and join the Labour Party and support the Labour Party. If language we use risks alienating voters rather than pulling them towards us.
And is that what Angela Rayner has done? I mean, if that was your deputy, Anas, and on the basis
I don't know
of what
if you've met
said,
Jackie Bailey. She's even more fierce than Angela Rayner is.
does she say things like that?
The great thing about Jackie Bailey is if she's got something to say, she'll say it harshly right to my face. She won't need to say it out in the press.
Right. I mean, is this an issue for Keir Starmer's authority?
I think there is a sense within his office that Angela Rayner is going to be Angela Rayner. You know, she speaks in a different way to a lot of politicians, and sometimes it helps her cause, and sometimes it clearly doesn't. And I was speaking to some of her supporters last night who were pretty much head in hands about this. This was not something they were pleased that this had happened, but they know that, you know, she speaks very much from the heart and without necessarily thinking through, you know, how things are going to land every time. I think for Keir Starmer, you know, they're not that concerned about it. They had another fight to win yesterday about changing the party rules and about making it harder for him to be challenged as leader, and they were focused on that, and they won that fight.
Right, and in terms of reasserting his leadership, you talked about, Jackie, what would you have done in the similar situation?
In terms of the rules?
No, in terms of what people say, if she'd used that sort of language.
Well, look I think Angela Rayner is Angela Rayner, and we should be proud of the fact that Angie is someone that is authentic, says it like it is, and says what she feels. But what we've got to be really clear about is how we talk about Conservative MPs in the Conservative Party. It can't look like we're talking about Conservative voters that way, because we need to persuade people who voted Conservative or SNP last time to vote Labour next time so we can actually win the election.
Right, well, Jack, you mentioned, of course, the backdrop to this conference are long queues at petrol pumps, there are fuel shortages. Let's just show people a couple of front pages. The Mirror, the petrol pump chaos, shambles. There's the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, on the front page. And also we have the Telegraph and their headline on this particular story, which, as you say, is gripping people. Plans for the Army to help ease fuel crisis. Tell us what the latest is, which does include the Army perhaps being called in.
Well, Boris Johnson's meeting to discuss this plan with senior members of the government this afternoon, but it does seem a little bit thin, this idea of the Army coming in. It's something that's been briefed out to the papers, but there doesn't really seem to be any detail about quite how that would work. And if you really want members of the Army driving big oil tankers around, there's quite a lot of training that needs to be done before you can get to that point. I think the hope really within government is that this whole thing is just going to go away of its own accord. Ministers think that what's happening now is that people are just filling their cars up because they see other people doing it, and that once those cars are full, then Britain will start to go back to normal again. That's the hope inside Whitehall, but they don't really have very much data on how much fuel there is in the country and how much is coming into the country, so they're kind of winging it a little bit at the moment.
Right, and we'll bring you any developments that may emerge while we're here at Party Conference. It has, of course, sparked
and how much is coming into the country, so they're kind of winging it a little bit at the moment.
Right, and we'll bring you any developments that may emerge while we're here at Party Conference. It has, of course, a clip of Keir Starmer. It's from Newsnight last year. It was during the Labour leadership contest, and the candidates were asked specifically about nationalising utilities. Let's have a look.
I'm asking you to raise your hands. When you go into the next election, would you have any of these in your manifesto, potentially? First of all, raise your hands if you're into scrapping tuition fees. That's everyone. Renationalising water and electricity.
And as yesterday, Keir Starmer was asked by Andrew Marr if he would nationalise the big six energy companies. He said no, it's been ditched. What's happened?
Look, I think there's a role for whether we're talking about public ownership of parts of our energy supply and energy distribution and full-scale nationalisation.
Right.
And I think when you look at the energy crisis, clearly we have a challenge about energy companies going bust. I think there is a role, I think, for publicly owned energy companies to help drive cheaper fuel to people across our country.
But he's ditched the principle and the policy and the pledge during his leadership campaign of nationalising the big six.
Well, look, what I'd say is the infrastructure, where the money is made is actually from the infrastructure, the production of energy, the distribution of energy, the transmission of energy. And I think the role that the public sector can play in those profitable parts of our energy supply is fundamentally important.
Right, you're trying to differentiate between partly perhaps nationalising parts of the energy sector, but that's not what members here and the party faithful voted for when they supported Keir Starmer. Are you disappointed that he has said there will be no broad nationalisation of the energy market?
I think we've got to do the right thing. We shouldn't be ideological about it. So, for example, in Scotland...
Hang on, you were ideological about it. Look, I mean, we can show I'm
going to say, I'm just
Labour
going to say
manifesto.
that.
Well, privatisation of our energy system has been a failure for people. Scottish Labour supports a national energy company.
Absolutely.
So it is ideological for you and practical, maybe. maybe, but that's what you want.
No, absolutely. I'm just going to say that I fundamentally support us having a publicly owned energy company. That's different from full-scale renationalisation of our energy supply.
How?
Although I think there's a role for that. Because, look, if you look at where the money is to be made around energy supply, one part, as I say, is about energy production, one part is about transmission, then distribution, and then the retail sale of energy. If you actually look at our energy market just now, the loss-making part is the retail sale part, and the transmission supply is the profit-making part.
Right.
So how do we have a publicly owned company that doesn't replace the big six, but actually is an alternative to the big six, that can drive down energy prices for individuals, I think is fundamentally important. And then how do we get the investment in infrastructure and that transmission and generation part, I think, is really important. Really important to bring down energy prices, but also really important to us to have that jobs-first transition away from the oil and gas industry.
I mean, how big an issue is this going to be for Labour, Jack? Because actually, literally yesterday, delegates passed a radical motion calling for a socialist Green New Deal based on public ownership.
Yeah, and it definitely looks pretty shifty of Keir Starmer to have said these things when he knew that he needed the support of the sort of left-leaning base to become leader, and now that he is leader, clearly tiptoeing away from what looked, on the face of it, like pretty clear promises he was making. I suspect that the calculation they've made in the leader's office is that these weren't pledges to the voters, they weren't pledges to the British public, they were pledges to the Labour Party members, which is a very different thing, and that, you know, when election times comes, most people out in the country won't have noticed, won't have cared. They'll be looking at a Labour manifesto and that Keir Starmer thinks is one that's going to win the country, and that's more important to them.
Thank you very much, Jack, for joining us this morning. See you soon, I hope. Are you going to ditch that manifesto pledge for wholesale nationalisation that you put?
No, absolutely. I want us to have a publicly owned energy company in Scotland. That was promised by the Scottish Government. We spent £500,000 trying to put it together, then the policy collapsed. I still support us having a publicly owned energy company. But how do we actually have a proper energy transition in Scotland is fundamentally important. The challenge we have at the moment is we don't have investment from the SNP or the Tories into what a truly just transition looks like. And that risks writing off entire communities, costing tens of thousands of jobs. We can't repeat that mistake again. So let's have a proper energy just transition. And that's why we launched our own energy commission that'll be led by former Energy Minister Brian Wilson.
All right, thank you very much, Anas Sarwar. Now, look, we've been along the coast here to Hastings, a seat near the top of Labour's target list, asking voters what they think of Keir Starmer, the party leader. First of all, can they name him?
Keir Starmer.
It was Jeremy Corbyn, I don't know who it is now.
Keir Starmer.
Keir, oh bless him. Yeah. He's so educated and such a clever man, but so unpopular.
I'd say anyone, including Keir Starmer, is a lot better than the leader of the government that we have at the moment.
I really like Corbyn, and but I think he was too strident for some people. So which is sad, but that's the state of how things are now. People are more looking to themselves, aren't they?
I thought at the beginning he was a great strategist and he was going to be coming out, and he'd spent all his apparent silence at the beginning. He was developing some master plan, but the master plan seems to be just to attack his colleagues, and I'm not really sure that's the way forwards.
I would be more inclined to vote for Keir Starmer than I would for Jeremy Corbyn. He listens to what the people actually want to say and he talks, whereas Jeremy Corbyn was just a silent minority who people shout and scream about but did absolutely nothing for the party, and it stopped a lot of very normal people wanting to vote for the left.
He seems to be woolly and just sniping from the side. I'm still not really familiar with any plan that they have. It's just very, very beige.
The general Labour Party voters won't look at the fact that he's very good for the party. They just look at the fact, is he popular, do we like him, would we have him round for dinner? I'm a Labour Party voter, but I'm undecided at the moment because I feel that my vote is going to be negligible because nobody's going to vote for Keir.
Well, the thoughts of some voters in Hastings. I just want to welcome our next guest, Laura Pidcock, former Labour MP and now a member of Labour's ruling National Executive, the NEC. Let me just get your response before you go, Anas. You heard what voters said, of course, a mixture of thoughts, but basically still a lack of definition from Keir Starmer. What's the one thing he can do to change that?
Look, I think we've already addressed the fact that we've had the pandemic.
Sure,
but I think
putting that aside,
I think fundamentally, is Labour's going to win on ideas, and it's right that we win on ideas, but we've also got to win on emotion as well. And I don't think the Labour Party has yet made an emotional attachment with the electorate to say there's a different story we can tell about Scotland, a different story we can tell about England, about Wales and about Britain. And I think it's really important over the course of this conference that we set out that alternative vision that actually wins the hearts and minds of people across the country. Not just Labour Party supporters, but much broadly than that too.
Anna Sarwar, thank you very much. Enjoy the conference. Laura, do you think Keir Starmer's done enough to define his leadership?
I think there's been far too much introspection. This has been a prolonged and intense crisis for working class people. It's been so difficult. We've just seen as well the removal of the £20 uplift to universal credit. And that is going to be absolutely devastating for people and what people want, and some people talked about it.
Keir Starmer had called on the government not to do that. So is there something about his leadership that he hasn't defined for you?
Well, I want him to be angry about what is happening to working class people, and I don't feel that.
You don't think he's angry? Now, what would you want to hear him say?
I think it is about being resolutely on the side of working class people. So I know the pandemic has been difficult. You kind of get out and meet people. You know, this is the first time he's meeting the Labour Party conference and meeting members. But actually, that is a crisis, and you are tested in a crisis. And when you are put in front of people, you know, in front of the Prime Minister, we want to see anger and to say, do you really know as a government what you are doing to working class people? Because people are suffering, and you know there was great initiatives like Clapton for key workers, but it's not being met by pay rises. It's not being met by Keir Starmer saying, actually, you are making these communities suffer.
Right. You talked about introspection. No doubt you're referring to the rule changes that have gone through. We can also show our viewers pictures of Jeremy Corbyn. You're a great supporter and fan of the former Labour leader. It's fair enough to say he's been very present here. He's been speaking at rallies. He's also been at various fringe events. Surely it's not helpful, though, to have Keir Starmer looking at Jeremy Corbyn or being haunted by the old leader?
Oh, come on. Jeremy Corbyn doesn't haunt anybody. He's a brilliant person who has fought for decades for all of the things that we saw in the last manifesto and in 2017. This isn't about kind of the Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, at some events he will overshadow Keir Starmer. There's just no doubt about it. Like
really?
in the youth movement, I can imagine he would get a warmer reception.
But is that helpful to Keir Starmer when he's trying to establish his leadership?
That's not within our gift to control. You can't compel people to like somebody more than somebody else, or feel like a leader is more on your side than somebody else. Honestly, what is just so important is that we get some perspective here. It might seem dramatic, but it isn't. Working class people are really suffering, and to have spent the whole of last week and the last few days talking about how we will change our rules as a party to kick, but it isn't. Working class people are really suffering.
You've mentioned absolute nonsense. Let's just remind viewers, this is the headline in the Financial Times. It says, Labour left fury as Starmer wins backing for rule book reforms. What did you make, though, of the changes themselves? You may not have wanted the focus to have been on it here, but do you think they are a triumph, as Peter Mandelson described them?
No. And the fury actually isn't that the right of the Labour Party would concoct this, that propose it to the NEC, of which I, of course, voted against. The fury is about what is happening in our communities and how the Labour leadership responds. So it is, you know, the crisis in the NHS, in housing. There's still no justice for the people of Grenfell. The serious situation we see with the cost of living crisis. And Peter Mandelson thinks it's a triumph to change some rules and give MPs more power in how the next leader of the Labour Party. It just shows how out of touch Peter Mandelson is and all of the people around him.
Well, you say he's out of touch. I mean, the changes mean future leadership candidates will now need double the number of MPs supporting them to get onto the ballot. And it'll be more difficult for local parties to deselect sitting MPs. Again, Peter Mandelson in his interview earlier said, you know, MPs won't have to look over their shoulder constantly at the fear of being deselected, and it would prevent the country waking up to Jeremy Corbyn or someone like him as party leader. Is that worth changing the rules for?
These people worked, and Peter Mandelson said himself he thought a lot about how he could get rid of Jeremy Corbyn and undermine him. And they helped deliver a Tory government, a hard right Tory government, in place of Jeremy Corbyn.
But what happened in 2019? You lost your seat.
And I was devastated to wake up with a Tory now presiding over a constituency where 8,000 people who are in receipt of universal credit are going to see it cut to his silence. And these people worked against a democratically elected leader of the Labour Party. And I'm asking them to have perspective. There is a serious crisis facing working class people. I don't know how many times I can say it. And the idea, because I told Keir Starmer that this would happen in the NEC, I said, whilst you want us to look out to the electorate, whilst you want us to be election ready, what your rule changes are doing are allowing the media a focus on internal Labour Party issues rather than the real crisis facing working class people.
But making someone more electable is important, isn't it? When you think it was the most disastrous election under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, if these rule changes make Keir Starmer or anyone else more electable, that would be better, won't it?
So there was a. I just want to remind people that there were lots of MPs who worked under Jeremy Corbyn that then resigned en masse while that man was trying to lead the party with very sensible policies about returning power to the workplace, renationalising key utilities, an increase to the minimum hour of pay, of which £10 is inadequate. You know, you just feel a sense that they are moving back from the radicalism that we saw at the very time when they need to be advancing on that radicalism because we are in a crisis.
Stay with us. Want to welcome Helen Lewis, writer at The Atlantic. Hello to you, Helen. Just your analysis, really, about, yes, the ever-present Jeremy Corbyn. He's been speaking at rallies and so on and so forth, against this backdrop of the rule changes going through. You've heard what Laura has said about being too introspective.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that was a difficult way to start the conference with two big rows that were not anything to do with policy, they were about process, both that and the cervix gate, as I believe we're going to call it now. But I don't think it's an unreasonable... You know, personally, I think that if you are an average Labour member, you ought to hope that the MPs have a better idea of who's a good Labour leader than you do. Otherwise, why the hell are they your MPs? And so I don't think there is a problem with having some form of, you know, the way that the Tory system does, where the MPs narrow it down to two people at the end. I don't think that in itself is anti-democratic. So I kind of disagree with Laura there, but I do think she's entirely right. Let's not be around the bush. This was an anti-Corbynite move. This was entirely designed to marginalise the left. So it is entirely OK for the left to be pretty annoyed about that.
Right. I mean, what about then the authority question around Keir Starmer? Because he did have to dilute some of these reforms, even though they've gone through, and Peter Mandelson described them as a huge triumph for his leadership. Was diluted. Again, his authority still not quite established.
He's definitely not the kind of great commanding colossus of the party in charge of all the levers. You know, it's very good for him that he got his General Secretary candidate confirmed. That could have been quite sticky. Also very good for him that he got the anti-Semitism inquiry stuff confirmed on a card vote. So those two things have gone well. But, I mean, Laura knows this far better than I do, but NEC is all about little deals and trade-offs and stuff like that. And in the end, that's what happened. He got saved by Unison.
Well, I mean, it is a process of negotiation, and what we were really
backroom deals.
Well, no,
deals and trade-offs and stuff like that. And in the end, that's what happened. He got saved by Unison.
Well, I mean, it is a delegates who are representative of the industries they work in and consult them. And the Labour Party presented us with these proposals basically a couple of hours before the meeting, and I made that point. I said, this isn't about backroom deals. This isn't about, you know, issues sorted behind closed doors. Well, trade unions have to go back and consult their members, and you have not given them time to do that, and they just rejected it.
Well, I mean, the backdrop, though, for this, when you look outside, are queues at petrol stations and people unable to get fuel. That is a very big issue. What do you make, then, Laura, first, and then I'll ask you, Helen, of ditching the wholesale nationalisation policy?
This is what I mean, Joe. Like, I take no pleasure in coming on here and disagreeing with the Labour Party.
But you do disagree with them on this.
But I do disagree with them because it also, just a really important point, was democratically agreed in conference that we agree with the nationalisation of utilities. It's common sense, isn't it? Why should there be private profit involved in essential?
So how big a mistake is this for Keir Starmer to ditch it?
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. Every time something like this happens, a few thousand members lose their confidence in him.
Well, I think what's happened, I went back and looked at Keir Starmer's 10 pledges because I thought, was I dreaming? I mean, last year was a pretty crazy time for all of us, you know, what did I miss? And it does say
You're back in the world of reality.
In black and white, in 10 pages, I support common ownership. And there was a whole row about what's the difference between nationalisation and common ownership, which I think probably sent almost everybody to sleep. But again, I don't think it's wrong for the left to think, hang on a minute, we elected you on a platform of party unity. Lots of people saw him as Corbynism without the figure of Jeremy Corbyn, and they quite like that. And what they feel is that they've been sold a pup on that. So I think he's ended up with the right policy. It's going back to a Miliband-era policy, right? Noel Dodonis said, like, we'll look at nationalisation. You know, on the case of, for example, railways, actually, there are lines that are struggling, and maybe we renationalise them. It's a piece-by-piece approach. It's a really sensible approach. It does, however, differ significantly from what he said in those 10 pledges. So people are right to point that out.
All right, well, let's hear a little bit more about the economic vision and the reform or even scrapping of business rates, because Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has been on her feet with her first conference speech. Let's listen.
This government is incompetent. This government is in denial. This government are careless and they are chaotic, and they are responsible for this mess. The Tories have lost control. These problems, Conference, have been exposed by the government's Brexit deal, by their response to the pandemic, and by a failure to plan for either. But today we are calling on government to freeze business rates next year, to increase the threshold for small business rates relief, giving small and medium-sized businesses in all sectors a discount next year. And Conference, to pay for those measures, the government should increase the digital services tax to 12% in the next year, to make sure online companies who have thrived during this pandemic are paying their fair share of taxes too. So I can announce today that the next Labour government will scrap business rates altogether.
That is part of Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor's speech. We can talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming, who I think is on the roof in the sunshine. He's made it all the way up there. Adam, give us some of the context and analysis around her speech.
Yeah, so lots of this stuff that was in the speech has been trailed over the last few days, even the last few weeks. So we've got new fiscal rules where Labour would only borrow to invest, and they balance day-to-day spending with taxes. We knew that was coming. There's also a big pledge to abolish business rates, but we don't actually know what they'd replace them with. We know what they do in the transitional period, whereby you'd kind of give a discount to smaller businesses and whack up the tax on the tech giants to pay for that discount. And then Rachel Reeves said there'd be a new kind of business tax at some point in the future, and she only gave very general principles about how it wouldn't target bricks and mortar places on the high street. It would be for the big profitable companies instead. There's also going to be a review of every single tax break in the system. Now, the total value of all the tax reliefs at the moment is about the size of the English NHS annual budget, so that is a lot of money. But the real rabbit out of the hat was this £28 billion per year for a decade on climate investment. So giving the UK the infrastructure to get to net zero and to create green jobs. That was the bit of the speech that hadn't been briefed in advance, and it's quite a surprise because it's quite a big number.
Adam, I don't know if you heard me, but is this why Rachel Reeves will want to be labelled as the first Green Chancellor if she makes it to number 11?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's clearly the mantle she's for herself, but it's not just about being green. She stressed again and again, she wants to be trusted with the nation's money. So that's why they would set up an office for value for money, which would be modelled on the Office for Budget Responsibility, which monitors the fiscal targets and the debt and the deficit and government spending. She said she'd have an equivalent of that, which would root out waste. Although I understand it might only have 50 people, and that its recommendations to the government would be advisory rather than binding. But really interesting, the things in the hall that got the activists going. It wasn't the stuff about fiscal probity. It was the stuff about spending big on the green economy, taxing businessmen like Jeff Bezos to the hilt, and also taking away the charitable status of private schools. That's the stuff that got the activists going.
Adam Fleming there, thank you very much. Let me welcome our other guest, Emily Thornberry, the Shadow International Trade Secretary. Hello to you.
Hello.
We'll come to the green investment in just a moment. But first of all, let's talk about some of the stuff that we did already know about, which was scrapping business rates in England. That's what Rachel Reeves announced. She was interviewed on it. What I'm less clear about specifically is what she wants to replace them with. Can you tell us?
The trouble with these questions, and you're absolutely right to ask it, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't. But the trouble is when answering it is that we have to answer it along the lines of what would happen if we were in government now? What will we do tomorrow? And unfortunately, we're not in government now, and we won't be making the decision tomorrow. But if we were in government now, if you'll want me to answer, is we will be introducing a digital service tax.
Right.
And then we will be moving towards new forms of taxation which are fairer, because our priority has to be the high streets. Now, I know that people are then saying, oh, but if there was to be this international agreement on what a fair level of corporation tax would be, then part of that deal is that you don't have digital service tax. I understand that, but this is kind of part of our problem when trying to answer now for what we will be doing in perhaps 2 or 3 years' time.
And all right, I take some of that, Emily, but as you know, people don't like paying taxes, so they like hearing that you're going to scrap and abolish taxes, but they will also want to know what could be coming down the track soon, even if they haven't got the fine detail. You sent round a 5-page briefing document on tax reform, but even this document is quite vague on what this new tax will actually be, and everyone wants a modern, fair taxation system. You mentioned the digital service tax. When we look at the money that you'd have to raise to replace what was raised by business rates, the Treasury figure on the value of business rates this year, 21-22, is £24 billion. The digital services tax is going to raise, on average, £2.1 billion. People will say, what is Labour going to do to taxes to fill that gap?
Yeah, well, that's what we were talking about in terms of introducing a fairer rate of tax at the top end. And then, as I say, the counter to that I think we're hearing from Conservative Central Office is, oh, but there's going to be an international agreement on a fair level of taxation, which is why it's very difficult. All we can do at this stage, and he was very light on detail, and there wasn't a great deal of questioning of him at that point, but it was seen as an important kind of placeholder. Obviously, in the end, he didn't actually introduce it, but I think it's important as opposition for us to be saying our priority will be, we are looking at our high streets. We can see that they're essentially closed down. There are charity shops and betting shops and pubs.
But
and
Emily, if you're going to be a credible opposition and you want to reverse the disastrous election result of 2019, people will want you to cost your spending commitments. Now, there is a bit of costing around this particular announcement, but if I read you the list and viewers are watching, you'll need £30-odd billion to scrap business rates. You want to make the extra £20 a week universal credit payment permanent. That's another £6 billion. You don't agree with the government's raising of national insurance, but you still want to spend an extra £12 billion on health and social care, and you oppose the foreign aid cut. That's another £4 billion a year. Why should people trust you if they don't know how you're going to raise the money?
Because I think that people are fair and people see that we are not in government now. We won't be, unfortunately, in government for a couple of years. And if we were to start giving chapter and verse on where we were raising money and how the sums added up at this point, it would be out of date in 2 weeks, in a year, certainly in 2 years' time. So all we can do at this point is show the direction of travel, what our priorities are, and where we want to end up going to. That's what we're doing. And that's what opposition's always do.
Direction of travel, is that really going to cut it with voters?
Do you know what? I find myself feeling an unusual emotion, which is I do actually, when these questions come up, feel quite sorry for the Labour Party. And often I think about the Labour Party, I sometimes think Labour Party are like pandas, and I don't think they really want to survive. They will often just say things and you think, why have you done that? But I do think that it has been consistently in the time that I've been covering politics for more than a decade now, that Labour have faced harder questions about how are you going to pay for this and do your sums add up than the Tories do. What is at the moment the deficit? Something like 98% of GDP? We have been through the biggest borrowing you could possibly imagine, and yet none of that has ever rebounded on the Conservatives about how has that money been spent incredibly sensitively. And I do think there is a point that Emily's saying, which is you do put down markers, but you can't fill in all the little details.
Except when you say direction of travel, we've just had this discussion. You think it's unfair on the Labour Party, but there were pledges made on public ownership, for example. Now that's been ditched by the looks of it. And so people will ask, What can we see? What can we trust the Labour Party to do with our money?
Oh, absolutely. And I know this is what I mean. It's not illegitimate to ask those questions. It's just that Labour are always playing, I think, on a slightly higher difficulty setting when it comes to fiscal prudence. Because the two stereotypes we have of our main parties are the Tory party can be a bit cruel but tough, and the Labour Party is soft and want to turn the money taps on. And so obviously they have to work really hard against that.
And that's why, Helen's right, and that's why I was raising the issue, you know why I was raising inheritance taxes, because the media accept that they never really criticised or held the Tories to account, George Osborne to account, when he said he was going to get rid of inheritance tax.
All right.
He was never asked how you're going to make up
But
the
I'll tell you one
difference.
thing you have said, and we've just heard from Adam there in response to Rachel Reeves' speech, £28 billion in terms of transition costs to a green economy. How's that going to be raised?
I've told you that all we can do is set out what our priorities will then be. I mean, there are important things as well in terms of we have said that we will only borrow to invest.
Yes.
And that's an important thing. We will go to the Office of Budget Responsibility and ask them if there is a crisis of sufficient importance for us to break those fiscal rules. You know, having that independence, I think, is important. And that, you know, they have a job as a watchdog, and we want to be able to listen to what they say. We say the same thing about the Office of Value for Money. It's the same thing. Let there be an organisation at arm's length who say, if you're going to be investing in this, is it really value for money?
All right.
I mean,
well,
I remember.
Just briefly.
Say this?
Yeah, go on.
When I was Shadow Defence, I remember Philip Hammond came into Defence, and he was amazed at the amount of money that was being spent in procurement on some things, and so he wanted there to be an independent body. And very soon, there was a kickback from the establishment, and they were pushed back and pushed back. Having an Office for the Value for Money is really important.
All right, let's talk.
People's taxes
it is very important, but what's
properly.
also important is what's happening right here, right now, in terms of the fuel shortage. You've seen the queues at the petrol pumps, and people are wanting to know when their fuel is going to arrive at garages.
Yeah.
What do you think this is down to, the shortage of HGV drivers?
Well, I think there's been a long-term shortage of HGV drivers, but I think that it's been made worse by us leaving the European Union and by the difficulties that people have getting across the border. It makes the lives of lorry drivers more difficult, and frankly, there's easier places for European lorry drivers to work.
So it is about Brexit?
No, it's not just about Brexit. There's a long-term shortage. I think that there's an underpayment of wages. I think that frankly, if you look at the facilities that lorry drivers have in the UK, it's appalling. You know, they are treated and no wonder there aren't enough people who wanted to be lorry drivers. We have filled some of the gap with European drivers, and that is now dried up since we've left the European Union.
I think there is also a fact that which brings it back to the digital services tax, actually, that lots of those drivers have moved to delivery driving, because this is an 18 months in which we've all had a lot of parcels delivered to our home. Those of us who've been working from home for the first time have been able to receive them. So that's a structural thing in the economy as well. And that kind of speaks to the fact that we are going through a change in the economy, that people like Amazon have had an incredibly good year. Their profits have absolutely boomed. And that is difficult because it's something about where you put the taxes. The same way that we have this long conversation about, are we taxing income too much and assets not enough? These are big structural shifts in the economy that actually parties should be responding to.
All right, I'm going to bring up Rosie Duffield, the Labour MP, who decided to stay away from this year's party annual conference because she felt threatened and worried about the abuse she might get over the issue of trans rights. She said she didn't feel safe. She didn't receive a specific threat, but she said she didn't feel safe. Now, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was asked yesterday on the MAR programme whether it is transphobic to say that only women have cervixes. Let's have a listen to what he said.
Well, it is something that shouldn't be said. It is not right. But, Andrew, I don't think that...
So Rosie Duffield should not have said that. Can you explain to people watching why she should not have said that?
Well, Andrew, I don't think that we can just go through various things that people have said. Rosie Duffield, I spoke to Rosie earlier this week and told her that conference was a safe place for her to come.
That was Keir Starmer. Emily, do you agree with Keir Starmer? It's something that shouldn't be said. It isn't right.
Well, it's factually inaccurate. There are men who have cervixes. There are men who are trans, and they're men. And so it's not, I mean, it's just factually wrong. Yeah, that's it.
I'm joyful because finally someone has given what I consider an answer that is actually responding to the question.
Yeah, and do you think people don't give?
Well, no, they don't. And I think a lot of that is the fact that they don't really believe it themselves and they feel that they have to say it or their activists will scream at them. Emily's entirely right. There are people who don't self-define as women who nonetheless have female biology. But what's really important about that is to say that that's fine, but we do need to record gender and sex differently. There are times, if you want to have NHS records and your NHS record says you're male, we still need a way to know that some of those people need to be invited for cervical smears. And so we have to, in law and policy, differentiate between sex and gender. That's the bit where it gets really tricky, because trans activists don't want us to do that. They want us to say they're exactly the same. And sometimes people can live as women, live as men. That should be fine with all of us in a tolerant society. But there is such a thing as biology, and we need to be able to talk about that still.
Right, was it transphobic then to say that women only have cervixes?
No, I don't think it is, because what you're saying is transphobia is fear or hatred of people. It's not fearing or hating trans people to say, oh, I thought you meant women in a biological sense. That's what I've grown up thinking, that some people are born women, born men. That's still common language. You don't have to have a PhD in gender studies to enter these debates. I don't think people say that with any hurtful intent. But as Emily says, there are people who are men, who see themselves as men, who live in the world as men, and they have cervixes, and that should be absolutely fine.
But Rosie Duffield says she feels threatened.
Well, but I think you're right, Helen. But I think the next stage is if there are men who have cervixes who identify as men, who quite often, frankly, have had quite a hard time, in the way in which they live their lives, to then have some people still shouting at them, saying, you're wrong, you're a woman, don't care what you say, you're deaf. Then I think we start getting into transphobia. I think we need to have a little bit more tolerance and a bit less shouting at each other, quite frankly. I personally am really sad that a great party like ours, is having this kind of level of debate.
Well, let's be clear about where the idea of no debate came from. That was Stonewall, the biggest LGBT charity in Europe's explicit position. No debate. Any debate on this subject, any debate on single-sex basis is transphobic per se. So I think this is not a culture war that Labour has been blindsided by. It is one that it wants to reform the Gender Recognition Act. It is one that it has walked into. And the thing is, we've got to have politicians who come on and explain this to people. Language has changed really quickly, and that's fine. But you know what? I still fill out forms that don't acknowledge that I can be a ms, and that's 50 years we've had that. So of course people haven't quite caught up. And what you absolutely cannot do is tell them there's something wrong with them for not having tuned in to the latest bit of activist language.
Right. I mean, taking the heat out of this issue is something we hear a lot, not just on Politics Live. Yeah. But does that actually mean that the party doesn't want to talk about it?
I think we should talk about it. I think that when it boils down to real people, when you think about real people and the difficulties that they have, then I think that any kind of aggravation or just melts away, because you then start thinking, actually, it's just people. It's just people trying to live their lives, and we should have a bit of space for one another and a bit of understanding.
All right, let's talk about Angela Rayner's comments. Someone earlier in the programme said they had their head in their hands, or they reported other people having their heads in their hands. Did you cheer and applaud what she said about the Tory government as being scum, vile, misogynistic?
Look, what she was doing at a fringe meeting where there may have been drink partaken, it's noisy.
You're saying she was under the influence of drink, and that's what made her say
it. People just need to know the atmosphere. It was not a sort of sitting around a considered debate.
Emily,
it was a.
She knew what she was saying.
It was. You know what these fringes are like. Anyway, so what she's doing is she's kind of going through all the comments that the Prime Minister has made that are misogynistic. Yeah. Then she goes through all the ones, or some of the ones that he's made that are racist. I'm just saying. She was putting forward evidence of him being racist,
was she right?
misogynistic.
Was she right?
Wait a minute. And then in the heat of all that, she calls them scum. Yeah. Probably shouldn't have said scum, but the rest of it, of course.
Right.
There's evidence of it.
She's not alone, of course, in using quite sort of flagrant language. You said about Donald Trump, he's a sexual predator. He's a racist. It's right to say that. We need to think about when our country got so scared.
Yeah, well, I mean, I won't say it without evidence, but there was evidence of all of that. Of course there was.
Do you think she should retract the word scum?
No, I think that what we should do is, in this conference, we should be talking about the ways in which we can change people's lives, the way in which what a different government we could be.
No, but that's what it was. Do you think she should retract the word scum?
No, I think that what we should do is, in this conference, I think that it was in the heat of the moment. I personally would apologise if I had, but I understand. With the context of it, I can see how it has happened. I don't think this is the biggest thing that has happened at Party Conference. I think the biggest thing that's happened at Party Conference is the public get a chance to see what the alternative government would be like, and that it doesn't have to be like this.
All right, well, on that upbeat note, thank you to Helen and to Emily, our first day here at sunny Brighton. Bye-bye.